Okay, cool, welcome. So my name is Ryan Weal. We're here to talk about taking Drupal 8 sites offline to do airplane mode surfing. I am based in Montreal. I have a small consultancy there. We're a bunch of freelancers. We're here at Badcamp 2016, and these slides are available on GitHub if you're interested in following along through that method. This link, I think, should take you to the repo, which gives you a readme.md version of this entire presentation. And if you click, actually, this one will take you directly into the slides. There's another link at the end that has the link to the repo. So that said, we will begin. So I am a mostly back-end developer. I've been working on migrations mostly for the past few years, and I took some time off this summer to learn new things, do some traveling, and have fun, and this is what I found myself learning. So I gathered a bunch of resources, and I'm now presenting them to you so that you can be aware of these strategies. Doing offline stuff like this has kind of been possible for a few years. For myself, I feel like I've been living under a rock, but you know, we'll just begin. So as many of you probably know, there's a lot of cases where you just don't have data. One of them is when there's Wi-Fi not available on the aircraft, or it's very expensive. You're traveling internationally without data. If you're bored while you're on the subway or the metro, wherever you live. Also, networks are slow. This is another thing that's kind of a sidetrack benefit of using these strategies. There's always these types of situations as well when you are going to the top of a mountain if you're hiking or something. And then lastly, we have this new point, which is half of the internet goes down because the internet of toilets, I want to say, the IoT devices start to have botnets and take down your DNS servers. So it's very pertinent since yesterday we actually had major outages on the internet. So these are the reasons that we might be interested in taking this strategy. There are workarounds to these issues that we've all kind of encountered before. Native apps are one of the biggest selling points, and this will come up again later in the presentation as we see why things are supported and why things are not supported. You can focus your sales, if you're a consultant, on only selling to online or connected customers. You limit yourself in certain ways with certain sites where you maybe aren't serving well to people in far-off lands if you're testing things only in your geographic market. So what people generally do is try to reduce the request time and increase your TTL values and things like that, aggregate things, minify things, use CDNs instead of this. I mentioned the module BigPipe for Drupal 8 here because there are some interesting aspects where there's crossover, and we'll see more of that as we go on. It's a very cool strategy. If you've never heard of BigPipe, it's the idea that you can serve your Drupal site similar to how Facebook serves their content, where immediately you see the frame of the page, and then as slow content gets rendered, it gets pushed down to you. That module is in core since, I think, Drupal 8.1. So if your network infrastructure supports that, then you can do that. So that's something that's a different strategy, but might have more tie-ins in the future. So a large part of this talk is to get you thinking about how to strategize about offline content. So you have to think about really what your visitors to the site want. Unfortunately, this really isn't focused on the editor experience. We can't really we're not talking about decoupling Drupal at this time. We're not talking about headless Drupal, although this is really going in the same direction as headless Drupal, which it kind of finally all clicked for me when I've always heard this concept being out there, and it's kind of the idea that you can make your content available offline. And I think the headless Drupal strategy maybe goes a little bit too far. This is a nice way to keep it all within your development project that you do within your Drupal site already. So one of the key things to take away is that you can kind of flag a content type or certain content that you think is suitable for your visitors. There's an example site out there that is the source of one of the modules that we'll talk about. and that was used for Front-End United 2016, and they made their conference schedules available offline. So if you had visited the site and then later like disconnected and later went back to the URL while you were offline, you could access all of the schedule data. I thought it was a very cool implementation. It's got me thinking about how can I make my own regional Drupal event like do a similar approach, because coming from Canada to the US, you often pay a lot for data. It's not as bad as going further away, but Canada's very expensive for data if you're coming into the country, because we have lots of protectionist laws about our telecom industry, and it's a thing that's kind of everywhere. It affects everywhere. So, and then it's also, again, you can kind of look at this as a strategy related to caching. So again, you can look at it as how long should your page load take. And the reason I put that in there is also to highlight the fact that a lot of JavaScript frameworks and things, like when you're thinking about putting stuff available offline, if you're like loading up this huge payload that you have to get somebody to consume before they go offline, you have to kind of also be considerate that maybe they don't necessarily need a lot of this stuff. So you have to also be thinking about like being kind to the visitor and saying, okay, you might need this offline later. I'm not going to, you know, push a gig of data down to you while you do have data access. So it's a consideration to take and be mindful of. In the same vein, like there's a temptation to like go and like build like a big JavaScript app on top of this that like lives within your Drupal site, and then you're starting to build up your page loads. So these are the main considerations that you're going to have to consider when you're thinking about your users and what they're trying to get from your site. There are some similarities with content security policy where you want to tend to prefer the same origin policy, where you're not like fetching 1,000 things from 1,000 different servers around the internet, because those things may not be available to the user when they're offline. So this is something that's important to consider. A lot of talks will be like pushing us all into like, the new buzzword is, you know, push everything into a CDN, or like embed things from elsewhere, just do Ajax calls, and this kind of works against your issues that you're going to face if you're offline. So it's something to consider that you may also want to, you know, have everything available in the sense that there's not going to be a URL that's trying to load. A good example of this, my friend suggested at lunch, is you like load up a bunch of tabs and then you get on board an aircraft and you're like, I'm going to read this article, and then your browser is like, let me help you reload the page, and you're like, why are you doing this? And in fact, one of my examples, I ran into that on my way here. I have 2 example sites that we'll talk about, and one of them I actually ran into this, even though it was supposedly designed to not do that, and then I looked at the code and realized, oh, something obvious just happened. So when I mentioned BigPipe earlier, I mentioned that like it loads the initial shell of the page. And the second strategy that we'll talk about, which is called Service Worker, kind of the strategies tend to push you in a similar direction, where you kind of load the framework of the site, and then you can queue things up in later batches. So that's another thing that we maybe want to put a little bit more separation between how is our site generally structured, and then how is our content structured. Again, the second half, we'll talk more about, you know, how you can actually queue some of that stuff with service workers. But before we talk about service workers, let's talk about AppCache. So this is a very simple strategy, and it works. And this is the one that so I have, as I mentioned, like 2 little apps that we're going to talk about, and they're exactly the same. One of them uses AppCache, one of them uses Service Worker, and the AppCache one was the one I was able to go back to when I was on the plane, and it just worked, and it always just works. And what you do is you simply add a text file that references all of the materials that you want to make available to people, including any assets that you want to attach to the pages. When you go to a page that lists the manifest file, it's going to download it all on the first hit. So this is something, when I said you need to be mindful of if you're bludgeoning your users with a ton of data, like don't go and put like a 1 gig library of photos in that page request. This is one of the limitations of AppCache, is that you kind of, it's all or nothing approach. The super cool thing about AppCache is when you make a request on your device, even if you don't have that page open, once you've gone to the website once, you can type in the URL when you are offline, and it will first look in the browser's storage and say, oh, I already have all of this. It won't even hit the network. So it looks first to itself to see if it has the content. And this is why it can be really advantageous in a caching methodology, where if you really want to like serve up the frame of your site really, really fast, it often can't get any faster than just serving it from the device itself. So that is something that's cool about it. The thing that's not cool about it is that it's already deprecated. And people are still rolling this out, so that's interesting, and we'll see why in the next slides. But don't worry too much about it being deprecated right now, because browsers. Let's look first at just structuring an app. So this is my example app that I have here. This is the one that worked for me, even though the other version broke on the plane. I have just an index.html. I have a .appcache file, and important note, this must be served as a text cache manifest. Most Apache and Nginx configurations, I believe, should take care of this by default, but if you're seeing like warnings or errors in your console log, that's something that you may have to configure if you've got a very unique configuration on your server. I have JavaScript in here, but it is by no means necessary for the AppCache strategy. And I've also been learning ES6, which is the new JavaScript standard, because we had a revolution in Drupal 8 with how we manage our code and how we structure things, and how PHP also had a big revolution from 5 to 7. JavaScript has also gone through this transition. So for those of us that have been living under a rock, that's kind of new information to me, and it's very nice to program with. So anyway, we have this link here, and that will take you to code example, and let's take a look at what some of that looks like now. So first, the index.html just looks like a typical index.html, and at the top of the file in the HTML tag, we just have a manifest that lists out this location of a text file. The rest of it you don't need to worry about, but if you want to see like what my app is, it's just these basically few lines of code, 5 lines of code that are just running with view.js, which was a dependency that I include. And here you see this is our manifest file. It has its title, it has a list of the assets, it has this network asterisk thing, and this is related to what things can and can't be in the cache, and it generally, every tutorial you'll read will always say just put an asterisk here and don't worry about it. If you run into something that you need to get more information, I would say, you can dig deeper on this, but for the most part, I haven't found a case where I've needed to ever look at it. There's also another parameter that you could put, which is fallback, and that would be like if the user goes to the root of the site and that part is not available offline, you can redirect them to an offline page that says you are offline, but I have these other things for you. I run into this Toggle, which is a time tracking tool, had this really cool thing that they would do, although they just released a new version and it broke, so they're re-implementing it at the moment. But you would like hit any page on their site and it would say you're offline, but if you were on the timer page, which is where you log your time, it would allow you to do just that one task. So that was really cool to find out when I was on a plane and I was like scratching the notes in my little notepad, and so I could remember to enter my time entries, and then I can just enter them here. So it had discovered that I was offline and told me, hey, you can just go to the timer page, that's okay. So it's a very simple file. The one thing that you really want to notice, I guess, is at the top of the file, I put just this custom string v11. And the way that the AppCache knows to go back to the network and get this file again is to change this file in some way. So you'll see that in the version of the Drupal module that was used for Front End United, they, I think, used a timestamp that got put into a generated version of this file, and that allows it to see that there's a difference and re-render it. So Again, very simple stuff. Here's my JavaScript. It's unrelated to this talk, but ES6 syntax in this version of it. I use local storage to store some data. That's an HTML5 feature. It's not the typical Vue.js format because I was learning Vue ES6, but anyway, if you're curious about that, that's there. When you're debugging, keep the console log open. It will tell you about issues that you're facing with it. I often reload twice just because you'll see like the first time you reload it like dumps a bunch of stuff. Like I think there's some new stuff. I just like to just hit it twice and everything's fine. And again, just remember that you need to update your serial number, or if you add a new file, that will be sufficient. But I always like to just have a serial number so I can remember. One little trick that I do is I put a D at the end of my serial number when I'm developing. And that way, like if I strip the D off, I'm not preventing my own browser from getting that new version. So that way I'm mostly just committing so the next one will be V12. But when I'm developing, I can go V12D, V13D, things like that. So you have to be a little bit mindful of, not reusing things. Doesn't really seem to complain. It's surprisingly easy and trouble-free. And this is what the thing does. So in this case, I used Firefox to render, and I just type in a note and it makes a thing. Unfortunately, I chose a stupid name. I searched to not have a name collision, and Google served me different search results. But in California, it tells me that there's something in the Apple Store by the same name that does pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to have to change that, but for now, this is here. So anyway, that's like my very simple thing that I built, and that's just HTML. There's two guides here that I point out that you can find more information on just the basics. And unfortunately, the second one here, application cache is a douchebag, is kind of a poorly named thing. But on the other hand, there's a lot of really valuable information in there, because the problem, as I highlighted earlier, is that the app cache sort of presumes a lot of things, like you're going to get all the content at once, and that may not be suitable for all applications. So that blog post is authoritative in that it describes almost all of the issues by, I think, a gaming company that has rolled this out and worked with it a lot, hit the issues, and then dealt with them. So that'll give you the overview so that we can all employ this deprecated strategy on our websites. So there's a Drupal module that I mentioned, and this is it here, and it was made for Front-End United. So if you were to go to the Front-End United 2016 website, it'll suddenly just blink and say, this is available offline. And it's really cool. It looks so simple and elegant. The app has its limitations, so it makes a lot of assumptions. And some of the assumptions are a little bit even more beyond AppCache. So the content, for example, is always going to live under this path offline. It presumes you're never going to have another level underneath that. So you can't even use a slash in your, if you want to go offline slash this thing slash that, no. It has to be one word. So you could, because you saw the earlier example, you may be interested in actually rolling your own thing. So I'm just going to give you a little tour of this, but just warn you about some of the limitations. It suppresses the theme from rendering, because sometimes your theme has aggregation turned on and the file names may not be predictable and things like that. So it's limited in that way. And I think what they did for Front-End United is they simply made a reduced theme. And that actually might be a smart approach depending on what your strategy is. I think Toggle used the same approach when they did that as well. But this is what the Drupal module does. It adds 3 new block regions. The images don't load when you create these new types, which I'll show you. You basically do this with view modes, largely, and it won't let you, it forces your home page to have a fallback to the offline folder, which, if you wanted everything to be offline, if it was just a basic static content site to the user, then that is kind of doesn't need to be separate, it could be the same. So there's kind of a separate site that you're building if you're using this strategy, if you're using this module. So yes, so I put this note here. There's a configuration page for this, and it covers basically all the stuff we saw in the previous slides. and you're like, oh yeah, this is great. I'm just going to plunk all my paths in here, and there's like 5 other tabs or 4 other tabs. And it turns out for your Drupal content, you actually want to put those in the other tabs. So for a while I struggled with it, like, why is it not doing anything? And it was like, oh, that's a Drupal URL. It actually has to go in this content tab. So, okay. So for setting things up, you have to enable some permissions for the anonymous user, or they won't be able to access this. You want to do, this is an interesting thing. Again, it was kind of like a single purpose module by the looks of things. So it tries to, I couldn't get this method working. It tries to add an iframe to sidebar first. I don't often use sidebar first. So there's a checkbox on the first page of the configuration that allows you to just like, it does things slightly differently and basically puts the manifest on every page. So just like make note of that if you're interested in rolling this one out. And clear the cache. It's like kind of an obvious thing, or rebuild the cache, I guess, in the Drupal 8 context. Because what I find is like once you add something to the manifest, it kind of wants to do, Drupal wants to do some things to refresh its caches so everything's there for you. So these are the things that were kind of like difficult parts in getting it working. Now for your content, what you're going to need to do is go to your content type and manage display. From there, at the bottom of the Manage Display page, there's a little fold away called Custom Display Settings, and you can enable other view modes. And there's 2 view modes that were created by this module, Offline Page and Offline Teaser. And you have to enable those in order to get nodes to be available offline. It's going to do things like strip out the attached images and any files, so be mindful of that. I think you can add them back in by going to the configuration page that's listed here, and you would put in, so you go to the configuration page after that, and this link is taking you to the content tab within the configuration, and you'll see it's got this interesting syntax. Do I have it on here? Input a node, path. Yeah, so maybe I didn't list this very well. We'll see an example on the next slide, or maybe the 2 slides in. Yeah, so it should return node 1. So there's this interesting syntax. Yeah, okay, it is clear. So in this case, beauty is the path we're trying to create. So it's actually offline/beauty would be the path that's being created. The slash is not part of the URL. It's just they're using it to break things apart. That can be then used to do other things. And then they're using the routing system path called node:1. So if you don't know what the routing paths are, those routing.yaml files in your modules are what control those. This may be a bit of interesting stuff to find out about if you're new to how the routing system works, but suffice it to say that node:1 is kind of a code way of representing the path that would, generally speaking, be /node/1. In this case, we're creating one called /offline/beauty. So it's a bit of a brain teaser. If you were to do views, you go to an existing or a new view and you add an offline display. So that little drop down at the top where you can add a new page or a new block, you would add an offline. And then you would show your content with an offline page view mode. So you're just remembering to use that view mode that you created for your content. So be mindful that you need to have your offline view mode. And then you go back to your config, and in this case, we're going to create a path called articles, so that it's going to resolve as /offline/articles. And what it's going to do is it's going to load a view that is called super awesome, and then the display of that view is called offline_1. So when you're editing views and you look in the title bar, or your address bar, sorry, you'll see that like these are the machine names that are used. So that individual display is the first one created. It's called offline_1 by default. And after this is done, and maybe do a cache rebuild, now you should have a path /offline/articles. And this is just a really quick look at the config. So that manifest tab that I mentioned shows you all the stuff that was in our HTML5 example. I'm showing you just the content tab to remind you that these are the 2 strings that we just created in the 2 slides. And then here is our beautiful site. So it's pretty ugly because I didn't do any CSS at all. I was able to click that link. So the things like going back and finding out and reconciling like how to get there. But yeah, it's going to need some CSS. So I'm not going to worry about that now.
Is the manifest the only way it knows to reload? So in other words, if any of your content gets updated, it doesn't matter.
Exactly, yeah.
And also with regards to the manifest, is there a way of building that dynamically, or is it strictly manual?
That's one of the limitations of this module. So that's why I'm saying, like, I wanted to take you on a little tour of how to do it generically and then to look at the module because it makes a lot more assumptions. So, yeah.
Is it only manual?
Yes, at this time, yeah. So yeah, that's the first point on this slide. The potential problems is new nodes are not added automatically. You sort of have to like really be very specific. It has a default style sheet that's included that you could like then list, and there's a style sheets and assets tab where you can add those things. There is an agency that last week published an article on Drupal Planet, which I will link to in the next slide, where they suggest like adding all of your aggregated CSS and JS to the assets tab, and I think you may run into some trouble with that if those get regenerated with different paths. So there's some concerns there, but anyway, there's like no like recommended approach for like when to prompt the user to reload the page, which isn't a difference. So that's just something to be mindful of, as I guess you were kind of asking there. Like, updating that manifest file is what does it. So in this case, it's automatically generated for us, but no option for separate caches. So it's just one cache. Like I said earlier, it's going to give you everything all at once, and that's it. It's like one payload. When you check that little box on the front page to just say don't use the weird sidebar first thing, I think it adds an iframe to the page or something, and just verify if you're not seeing it working that it is in fact putting the manifest reference into your HTML tag at the top of the page. I think by default it only wants to be on the pages where you are actually caching that page offline. So this is that blog post that I mentioned. I was really like shocked and amazed to see that some other agency was working on exactly the same thing this week. So it's deprecated, but we're all doing this. So they have more detail with more screenshots on those last few slides. So very similar approach. Now, the reason that it's deprecated is because there's this thing called service worker. And you'll often hear the term progressive web app, and there's kind of some related functionality in here. You can add to your home screen, and you could actually provide a manifest file for service worker and also do the add to home screen thing with the APPCACHE methodology as well. The tutorials all want you to load the shell first. So it's like, here's the shell of the site, and then you can actually break out and have separate caches so you can have the content with a different payload, and that's something that's super cool about it. Well, yeah, one of the recommendations is to use it for the loading of site assets and just have like that frame of the site come up really, really fast and just use it as a caching strategy. So that's kind of neat. And the module for Drupal that we're going to talk about does do that exact strategy. It does sound a little bit like BigPipe in the sense that it wants to push the generic content down to you fast. So I'm thinking, I don't know too much about how BigPipe works, but it seems like there could be some potential integration there. And I put a link to, I had done a version of just that raw HTML5 version as a progressive web app, and I made that a separate repo. I've been using that as a standalone application in quotation marks on my Android device, because when I added it to the home screen, then if I launch that, it pops its own window, and it's outside of Chrome at that point. It's still Chrome underneath, but it's a separate window. So, and that broke on me, but we'll look at that in a bit. The manifest file is JSON format. It does require JavaScript or it won't work at all. The tutorials all want you to do this loading icon type of thing. You don't really have to, but if you're going to load the app shell first and then bring in your content, that might be a really good thing. The really big things in this strategy are these 3 states: install, activate, and fetch. So AppCache was really only doing install. It was like, boom, there's your data. Okay, see you later. Activate happens when you start up the application for the first time. And then fetch happens when you request content. So when you type in a URL, fetch is going to happen. And anytime you click a link or try to make a request, fetch is going to happen. And this allows you to intercept all requests that are happening and say, do I make the decision myself as a developer? Do I have this in this cache? Do I have it in that cache? Do I have it in this cache? No? Okay, go to the network. And you can set your own strategy, like go to the network first, go to the network second. One strategy that's listed in one of the blog posts I'll reference here is like race them. Like, this disk is slow, this network is fast, let's see which comes back first. You can do that because you can define your own fetch. So you're free to create any types of caches you want, and it'll just intercept those requests. So, okay, now, is Service Worker ready? And the answer is no. And the reason is Safari doesn't do anything with it. And why is that? They want you to build apps for Apple platform. Microsoft has also been slow to pick up on this. However, they are now, if you go to this page where is Service Worker ready, it will show you the first part of the page is like, does the browser have enthusiasm for this? And so Microsoft apparently has enthusiasm for it, and some of the things are implemented, but not all of them. So you can go look at that page, and it will tell you the status of install, activate, and fetch. Those are again the big 3 things. So we're just gonna start our code here. We're gonna create a cache name, and we're gonna list out a bunch of files. So great, that's very simple. And then we're going to use that data. So this is install, and this is pretty much just straight from a Google how-to. Again, the link is somewhere in this document toward the end. And we're just opening the cache, and then we're going to fetch, we're going to give it the names of the files that we want. So that's our boom, we've installed it. It went and fetched all that initial payload. Now, here's the problem that I had when I opened this application on an aircraft, where it suddenly showed me this. It's like, oh, I remember that dinosaur. And it's in French because I live in a French area. And if we go back to this code, you'll see that the example code, actually, the first thing it does when it starts up the application is destroys your cache. It's like, I want to delete everything and get it again. But I hadn't started the app before I got on my aircraft the last time. And so this is what happened, was that I was just using the example code, and it was trying to show you that you could do these things, and I didn't actually read it very carefully. So I'm telling you now that if you do the tutorials, all the tutorials pretty much tell you to do this, and it's that can be annoying because I just started that up when I got on the airplane and was like, why can't I use it? So I did extra research and found that out for you. This is what the fetch command looks like, and you'll see here it's just taking the variable of the cache name that we had and then responding with a request. It checks the cache for the data first, and if it doesn't have it, then it's just going to go to the network. And I put a little comment in here, iterate on your other caches. There's other examples that are listed in another authoritative blog post, which we'll see at the end of this section, and you can go find more detail there. And I put these many alternate variations of this here. You can go to it's the offline handbook is the one that contains all this information, so you'll see that link further on in here. When you're debugging and when you're trying to build this version, you're going to need HTTPS on your site, or it won't let you do anything. If you don't have HTTPS, you have to use the word localhost in order to test it. If you're just working on an IP address, as I do because I use Docker, it won't like that because it's not called localhost. So they're really trying to prevent you from shooting yourself in the foot with your security, which is kind of pleasant, but not. Using the console log is always good. Yes, so updating the cache keys with each revision. If we go back to our initial schema here, our cache name, they often use this as a key. So I have X6 as my serial in this one, and I maybe should be doing something to delete the cache, but if I'm no longer using it, but I'm not worried about that for this example. So just watch out for like making every page request download everything all at once. This is, you have the ability to, you know, fetch stuff and load different caches at different times. There are some circumstances where your cache can expire, like if you write code that actually deletes the cache when you start the application, that can be a thing. Also, there's storage limits on different browsers, and you can query to find out what the limit is so that you don't go over it, but just be mindful that, again, you shouldn't like give somebody a 1 gig photo gallery and then like hope that it's not going to be destroyed, because the browser is going to clean up after itself if it starts to get really ridiculous. So I ran into this issue. There's no reload button if you don't design one into your application, but it is still a Chrome app underneath, so you can just like pull down and it will still reload unless you override that. So this is what it looked like using the Google example. It's the same application that I built, but I just used some stock CSS that the tutorial gave me, and otherwise it's the same app. And then you'll see here that this is what my application switcher looks like on my phone, and I've got 3 versions of it up, and you'll see that the one with the green bar is a standalone app, and then Chrome is smaller to the side with the same data. And in fact, it uses the same local storage, so those are exact mirrors of each other. Firefox is at the bottom, and that's the other version of it. So okay, so there are modules that I mentioned in Drupal 8 for doing service workers. The PWA one, which is the first one, they're both by Nod, and if I put an underscore at the end of his name, NOD underscore, it's going to break my markdown file. So anyway, there's these 2 modules. Service worker, it seems to be his like initial testing of this strategy, and there's no official release. And then I found PWA, which has a Drupal 7 version as well, and it's largely used to cache your initial site shell. It's like to increase the speed of serving things by serving things from your device. And on the homepage of the PWA version, it says that it's really like Chrome and Firefox, again, because Safari doesn't do anything with it, and only like newer versions of the Microsoft series of browsers will like attempt to do some things. So again, go to that is a service worker ready page. Okay, so what it does have support for is the idea of installing your site like an application. So this would actually give you like a configuration for a custom icon and the like add to home screen. That will give you this separate browser pane like you saw in my example in my application switcher there. And you can pick what URLs to cache when the install event happens. It's intended to help speed up CSS and JS, and the code does look to try to become aware of like images and attachments, but it does not cache them by default. So this is maybe an example implementation you might want to extend if you want to like include some thumbnail images. And there is a cache key set in there, and I've seen there is like a request in the issue queue to make it a little bit more simpler to update. I haven't done a lot of testing with this one, so I can't tell you if that's really like a hard limitation or not. But anyway, somebody ran into that issue, and that might be a thing if you run into troubles with it. So there's 2 links here. Your first progressive web app was the tutorial I followed to do the service app or the service worker version of this app that I did in raw HTML. And this other one to add service worker and offline into your web app is very similar. I like the first one better, so take your pick. But reading both of these will kind of get you a good idea of what's going on and what's possible. The code examples in the first one are definitely better, in my opinion, but you know, coding standards are everybody's like debatable things. This offline cookbook is where you'll see different examples of all the different fetching strategies you have, where you could like race the network and the disk to see which is faster. You could look to the network first. You could look to the network sometimes. You could look to the network. You could like first serve the cache, and then if you're online, query in the background and then like update the content while the user's looking at it. And the really nice thing about this blog post, it's a huge blog post and it is full of code examples. So he's even got like diagrams of like each different strategy of like how to fetch stuff, so that you can see like, oh, I could actually race the disk against the network. Like that kind of blew my mind when I saw that. And then I lastly include this one, which we didn't really talk about, but you know how like when you go to a website and there's that annoying thing like, you should install our app. Well, there is like a banner that Google recommends that you put for these kind of apps, and it works in a kind of a nice way where it says, if you've been to this website before, and this is the second or more time having visited this site, and it was more than 5 minutes between the first time you came here and the second time you came here, then you're probably more interested in this. Like, you're not just here because Ryan's talking about it in a session. So it's kind of neat in that way. Like, I like that it wasn't just like, boom, the first time you hit the site, install stuff, get our newsletter, do all this annoying stuff. It's like, okay, the second time you come back, it's going to be like, well, it's been more than 5 minutes since the first time you were here, so obviously you're interested in this, and that's when it pops the banner. So this page also has the information for how to do the stock Android way of doing that for native applications as well, further down the page, just to give you a comparison. That's going to be my next step if I were to keep going with these things after I rename them to something else. So yeah. That's it. Sorry I had to talk really fast. We've got like 4 minutes for quick questions if you want. And this URL will take you to the GitHub repo, where you can then click the first link in the presentation in the README file to see this in slides mode. And that's my address on Twitter if you want to follow up later.
I have a question.
Sure.
For Safari and IE,
Yeah.
do you do a fallback from service workers to manifest?
You can do definitely like the app install thing. I haven't seen any talk about that. It's a question I have as well. Like, I think you probably could if you did it like as a separate folder. With the PWA module in Drupal versus the offline app module in Drupal, they both want to use the /offline address. So that's going to be a conflict that you'll run into on the Drupal level. There's nothing really preventing you from doing it that I've seen. But that said, I haven't seen talk of people doing it. So it could be an interesting strategy. My thought is probably to keep it separated in some way where like you have a different path for one and versus the other. Because Service Worker uses JavaScript, it just does if in Navigator Service Worker, then load serviceworker.js is typically the approach. So essentially it just won't run if the service worker is present. You could probably do something that would be like the AppCache version would be like there, and then you could complement it with even more stuff for those that have it, and just like load a JavaScript menu that would have access to those other things if it's present. So you could probably do like a really baseline version and then use JavaScript to fire people off the other way. So that's kind of why I wanted to go through the code examples, is like the code itself is so simple that like when you get the concept, it's sort of like, oh wait, I could really architect this any way I want. So yeah.
I thought last year was a whole session on a mobile version of Drupal, right? That would allow you to basically create an offline mode, or is that my imagination?
I don't know. I'm not sure if there was a talk on that in the past. Yeah. Don't know. Sorry. Yeah?
Two questions. In the one slide you showed where there was Chrome, Firefox, and an app, was that like a basic app you created yourself just to demonstrate the differences, or was that something that was created by it?
No, I bought the only BlackBerry Android phone they ever produced, and the only thing they customized in Android is they added a third application switcher, and you can get that off the Android store, or whatever it's called.
Part of what you were doing, it's just...
No, it's just what it does. Okay. So like if you were in the standard Android switcher, you would just have like 3 tabs or whatever they are.
So the second thing is, in any of the stuff you were doing, all the stuff is like reading stuff offline. Was there anything that you saw about like entering data on a web page for offline storage to later send to the server?
No, but that's something that's been in my mind is like, well, you could just store stuff in JSON for a while, and then when you're back online, like start shoving that stuff into Drupal. And I was like, I could go further with this, and then I realized there's a lot of stuff to talk about here already. I think you could do something, yes, you probably could. I haven't seen anybody doing it. I know that Acquia released this thing called waterwheel.js, and you could probably use something like that. And that's why I was saying, like, there is this kind of like potential where you're like, I could just like build this entire app on top of like the JavaScript of my site that would, yeah, consume like incoming data, and then when you're back online, push it back in. The big thing would be the authentication, which I believe the waterwheel.js thing probably manages in some way for you. So
I thought I read at some point there's some aspect of HTML5 that does that, but I haven't seen anything that would seem to take advantage of it.
yeah, so the example code that I myself wrote for my mini app just puts things into HTML5 local storage, and I use just like a simple, it's very simple where you just throw a JSON object at it, and so this is how you use HTML5 local storage. You just like local storage dot set item, and you give it a keyword, or local storage dot get item to retrieve it, and you can just stuff anything in there. So you can, you know, develop to your heart's content, and you just put stuff there temporarily, and then when you go online, you can then deal with it. Yep.
Actually, to add on to that, one interesting technique that I've seen is using CouchDB. It's kind of like Couch, but
Oh yeah.
it basically loads the whole database, whole Drupal database on the client.
Interesting. So you're using CouchDB to load the entire database on the client side. Cool. Interesting.
I'm not sure though.
Huh. Like, since I mentioned, I'm more of a backend developer, like learning about local storage and stuff is like, wow, I've been living under a rock and there's cool stuff. But like this made me think, yeah, CouchDB and a lot of the NoSQL databases, like that's the same syntax as local storage, where you just like drop in a JSON object and it's just going to save it somewhere. So there's lots of potential for integrating with other applications.
So I spend a lot of time offshore in the 65%, which is ocean.
Okay.
And one of the strategies we do when we actually consume content from websites, which obviously go offline and when you're 5 miles offshore, is one, you save the page locally.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of plugins for Firefox, which basically saves all. Right?
Yeah.
So we can then read them off a local hard drive. But the second one is obviously PDF.
Yeah.
Much more, you know, it's old,
Yeah.
but it does work. And they
It's
have
true.
forms which you can store locally even in PDF, and then when you get back, you're sure you can submit them.
Oh, that's cool. Was that through a browser plugin as well, too? Or they're just PDF forms?
It's a
Or
PDF Pro version that allows you to store data locally.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, in that like comment I made about like making camp websites, because Front End United sort of did this, it's sort of like, well, I've also seen a similar approach where in Costa Rica at their camp at the end of August, somebody had made like a PDF that was like the one page for day one, one page for day two. It was amazing seeing how many people just had that on their phones the whole day and were like, oh, there we go. Like, and so it is very useful to people. And a lot of these events that we go to, like we are often like in international context. So lessening the amount of data consumed like on demand can be very beneficial to people. We're like 3 minutes over, so maybe we can like talk in the hallway if people are interested. But thank you for coming, and good luck with your offline applications.